Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. I decided to start this video the way I used to start my classes. Unfortunately, I don't have a door to slam, but we'll work on that and see if I can't find a good sound effect. So the last time we left off, we hit the armistice on November the 11th in 1918. And again, remember, they're signing it in a train car. The shooting comes to an end at 11 o'clock in the morning, and now the war's over. They're going to have to negotiate how to make a peace. So the first thing we have to do in this video is what are the impacts of World War I? Why is it a world war? So the first thing we'll take a look at here is how many people are involved. In the Central Powers, you can see that the troop strength was 22,850,000 soldiers from the Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire. On the Allied side, which is the Triple Entente, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and the United States, at least in terms of the big countries, we've got about 42,200,000. And so you can see here why exactly it is that the Central Powers lost this particular war. They were just simply outmanned. When we look at some statistical data here, we can see that Russia, of course, had the biggest field army in the First World War, about 12 million soldiers mobilized in the Russian army. Germany, of course, had about 11 million. The British Empire fielded almost 9 million. France had a little over 8 million. Austria-Hungary had about 7.8 million. Italy had about 5.5 million. The United States had just over 4 million. Turkey had about 3 million. Right? And then, of course, we have some smaller countries there that get involved on one side or another, and the relative size of those, right? So you're talking about millions and millions and millions of soldiers moving around the world, moving around Europe, fighting each other in trenches, outside of trenches, and this shows us, the scale and why World War I is such a big deal. When we look at casualties, of course, we also need to take into consideration military casualties. So, of course, the people who suffer the worst here would be the Germans. They lose a little over 1.6 million. Russia also loses a little over 1.6 million. France would be next with a little over 1.2 million. The British lose about 800,000. The Austro-Hungarians lose about the same, 800,000. The Italians lose 500,000, give or take. The Ottomans lose a little less than 400,000, right? That's just military casualties, right? That's just soldiers being killed in battle. So again, it's a huge consequence. We refer to these folks as the lost generation because so many of them died as a result of both World War I, and then, of course, the other thing to remember is the Spanish flu epidemic, the H1N1 epidemic of 1918. On the other side of this, we can see some interesting statistics here, which is World War I civilian casualties. This isn't the military, these are civilians. These are non-combatants, people who died as a result of the war. You can see here that the Ottoman Empire, of course, has a huge number of casualties. One of the reasons for that is they continued their push for nationalism, and if you guys remember the Armenian genocide, that's included in this because they used World War I as a reason to continue that genocide. Beyond that, we see that Serbia and Russia suffer horrendously, as well as Germany, and one of the reasons for that is the war kept moving back and forth across Russia, and a lot of civilians got trapped and a lot of civilians got killed. Interestingly enough, if we look at the Western Front in Belgium and in France, and the British Empire as well, you can see that there are almost no civilian casualties. And the reason for that was if you were a civilian in France or in Belgium and you didn't want to get killed in the First World War, you simply didn't go near the trench lines and you were relatively safe because we know for sure that those trench lines didn't move very much. So in terms of the impacts of World War I, it's a huge, incalculable impact. And again, we refer to this World War I generation, people born, somewhere around 1890 up to about 1900. We refer to them as the lost generation because we really did lose them, both to the war and to the flu. Now, when we talk about how the war itself was actually negotiated to an end, one of the people who's really, really super important is President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. Now, President Wilson was the guy who really came up with an idea, 14 ideas, for how to actually conclusively end the war and hopefully prevent another war from happening at all. He put together a speech which is called the 14-point speech, which is going to be in our Google Classroom, and you're going to take a quiz over your reading of the 14 points, in which you're going to have to basically identify the 14 points of the 14-point speech. He makes this 14-point speech to Congress in which he lays out his plan for peace, which he's then going to have to convince the Europeans to adopt. When he gets to Europe, we see that 4 major leaders of the 4 major Allied powers become the kind of power players in the negotiations. So from left to right, we've got the United Kingdom's Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. Next to him, the second guy from the left, is Vittorio Orlando, who represents Italy. Third from the left would be Georges Clemenceau, who represents the government of France. And finally, of course, we've got President Woodrow Wilson. Now, each of these 4 men have 4 very different sorts of ideas of what they want to accomplish and what they're going to allow to happen at the negotiations. But the big 4, they're the ones that are really running the show when it comes to the negotiations of how World War I is going to end. Their goals are relatively simple. Woodrow Wilson wants peace. He wants a lasting peace, and if it can last forever, that's going to be great. David Lloyd George is looking for money to rebuild and improve the British Empire, because of course they've suffered from the war and they're worried about retaining that empire. Georges Clemenceau from France, what he really wants is to weaken Germany so that France is safe. And if you remember, this comes after a long history of back and forth between humiliations between the French and the Germans and the creation of the empire. If you remember the creation of the German Empire in the Palace of Versailles after the Franco-Prussian War, this is what Georges Clemenceau is trying to fight back against. Vittorio Orlando, remember, Italy is a brand new country. Well, not brand new, but they've been around for only a little bit of time. They're a relatively weak empire. They want to be seen as a major power, and they want land, especially from Austria. Other people who are able to participate in these negotiations would be other sorts of ethnic minorities from Eastern Europe, and really what they're looking at is nationalism, which of course was one of the causes of World War I to happen at all. They're looking for independent nations for their own countries, and they're going to go and they're going to fight for that. Now, when it came time to decide where to hold these negotiations, of course, the French decided that they were going to take control of that decision, and they decided to hold the negotiations in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. And so, of course, everybody from my class should remember exactly why this is a big deal, right? This is where the German Empire started. They intend that this is where it's going to die, too. They're going to punish Germany in the Hall of Mirrors, which is where the Germans started the empire to begin with. Now, a couple of rules for these negotiations. The first rule that's really super important is the Germans are not allowed to participate. This is going to be an imposed treaty, and they are going to have to accept it. The Central Powers are going to be forced to accept whatever peace these guys come up with at Versailles. So at Versailles, what we get is there's actually 4 different treaties that come out. Most people will simply refer to these treaties collectively as the Treaty of Versailles, but it actually is 4 different treaties that they're going to sign. So the first one is actually called the Treaty of Versailles. It was signed in 1919, and specifically this was the peace that was imposed on Germany. A couple of major points you guys have to know about it. Number 1, Germany was forced to accept the official blame for the war. They were responsible for the war. Which, if you think back to the other videos, isn't really fair because they were like the 4th country to declare war, but they were forced to accept official blame for it. Second, Germany was assigned reparations, and in fact, they were assigned most of the reparations. Reparations are payments to pay for things that were damaged, destroyed, or lost during the war. Germany ends up having to pay $33 billion in 1921 dollars to the Allies to make up for what was damaged during the war. That's pretty much a crippling sum. That's over $300 billion today, so that's a humongous amount of money that Germany has to pay to the Allies. Third, Germany has to give up Alsace and Lorraine back to France. Fourth, they have to give territory to Belgium, Denmark, and Poland, and I can show you that right here. You can see on the lower left-hand side, Alsace and Lorraine are going to France. Belgium is going to get that little piece of Germany in the west. Denmark's going to get a little piece of Germany up there on the peninsula in the north. The new country of Poland is going to get a giant chunk of land called the Polish Corridor. The city of Danzig, or Gdansk, is going to be made an independent state, or country, which is going to be administered by a new group of people. Germany also is forced to give up all of their colonies in Africa, China, and the Pacific Islands, and those would be distributed to the different members of the Allied powers. Germany's army is going to be restricted to 100,000 soldiers, so pretty much big enough to hopefully defend Germany, but never big enough to invade anybody else. The Treaty of Versailles also imposed the provisions on Germany that said they were not allowed to make military machines or equipment like tanks and airplanes and machine guns and artillery and all kinds of things like that. And also the Rhineland, the area around the Rhine River, was going to be demilitarized, which means that it will no longer be allowed for Germany to send a military into the Rhine River Valley. And the Rhine River Valley is over there on the western side of Germany, very close to France. That was one of the things that France demanded, is that we have to be safe from the Germans. So that's the Treaty of Versailles. Doesn't set Germany up to be super, super successful. Definitely not. And we're going to see the consequences of that in the next unit. When it comes to Austria-Hungary, one of the first decisions among the Allies' Big Four was that they were going to split those into two different countries, Austria and Hungary. And when they did this, they had to sign two different peace treaties. So the treaty with Austria was called the Treaty of Saint Germaine in 1919. First provision is it ends the Habsburg Empire. No more Habsburg Empire. It creates newly independent countries in Europe of Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. It also says specifically that Austria and Germany are never allowed to unify. That is something which is prohibited by the Treaty of Saint Germaine. It gets rid of the Imperial Austrian Navy. It reduces the size of the army to exclusively 30,000 volunteers. It gives fairly large chunks of land to Italy, although not as much as the Italians wanted, and Austria was also forced to pay reparations. Hungary, once it was created as a separate country, it got a treaty of its own, which is called the Treaty of Triannon in 1920. It gives about 3/4 of Hungarian territory to the new nations of Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. And Hungary didn't have any opportunity to negotiate that. It reduces the Hungarian army to 35,000, and it gives them reparations payments as well. Although, again, none of these reparations are going to be anywhere near what the Germans are paying. Finally, the Ottoman Empire, who of course joined after the war began, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, and by 1920 it was really referred to as the country of Turkey. After 1920, they had a separate treaty too called the Treaty of Lusanne. This was signed in 1923. It recognized the new country of Turkey. It also took away a lot of their territory, so it created what was called mandates, which was Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. Those were given specifically to the British Empire to help control them until they were able to run their own countries. And then the mandate of Syria was given to France. But the big thing was that they made no provisions to give reparations to Turkey because, of course, the Ottoman Empire was gone and the new country of Turkey wasn't held accountable with that. Finally, of course, one of the big issues here was in the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles, they decided to create a new group called the League of Nations. The League of Nations was supposed to be a place for all the countries in the world to go to air their grievances and to help everybody else to help them to solve their problems without ever having to fight a war again. This was supposed to be the key to peace forever. If you let countries negotiate their problems and all the countries of the world come together and help you negotiate your problems, we might never have to have a war again. And that was the thinking. It was called idealism. Ideally, if we create a perfect system, war will go away forever. Now, a couple of major problems with this League of Nations. Number one is it didn't have a military of its own, which means it could not enforce any of its own decisions. That's a problem. If you do something the League of Nations doesn't like, they're going to send you a letter, they're going to tell you they don't like it, and then they're not going to be able to do anything else about it. Second problem is the League of Nations doesn't have a whole heck of a lot of money, which means they don't have a whole heck of a lot of ability to actually enforce any decisions beyond just sending a letter. Third, if you'll notice up here on the map of the League of Nations, the United States never joined. It was our president's idea, but in the Constitution of the United States, it says that a president can negotiate a treaty, but he can't make it happen on his own. He has to bring it back to the Senate of the United States, and the Senate has to approve it. When President Wilson brought the Treaty of Versailles and the other three back to the United States, he took it to the Senate, and the Senate refused to approve the provision about the League of Nations. They said, if we join the League of Nations, we might have to go to war again for somebody else's problem. And since World War I wasn't as much fun as everybody thought it was going to be, they decided that they did not want to participate in the League of Nations. So it's kind of a strange thing, because it's almost like the United States formed the party, organized the party, and then didn't go to the party. So everybody else kind of looked at that as a phony, baloney, nonsensical thing, and it really weakened the idea that the League of Nations was something that was good and was going to ultimately work. The final thing that we have to see here is the consequences for Europe, this is the map of Europe before the war. After the war, what we see is Europe looks completely and totally different than it did. New countries, new nation states, old empires are gone. Germany is being punished, and they hope that this is going to be the key to another concert of Europe. They're looking for a lasting peace, and they hope that this plan is so well put together that it will create a peace that will last forever. Now, in the next unit, we'll see how that peace breaks down, and ultimately we all know, of course, that there's going to be a World War II, and we'll definitely get to that. Make sure that in the Google Classroom that you read through the PDF of the 14-point speech by President Wilson. There will be a quiz on what each of those 14 points is. And I will see you guys later. Make sure you leave comments in the comment boxes below, and let me know if you have any questions. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.